Hi there. Tonight we tumble into a world where lace and propriety often concealed a desperate yearning for escape. Imagine yourself in a grand Victorian drawing room, the heavy drapes muffling the distant sounds of horse-drawn carriages, a delicate teacup poised in your gloved hand. You're smiling politely, perhaps discussing the latest embroidery patterns or the virtues of a new charitable endeavor. But beneath the layers of silk and social grace, a quiet terror churns. For you, a woman of this rigid era, marriage isn't just a union of hearts, it's a destiny, an inescapable societal decree that dictates your entire future. And for some, a future so suffocating, so devoid of choice, that the only perceived escape route is the ultimate disappearing act. You see, the legal and social binds of Victorian matrimony were so utterly complete, so utterly binding, that for certain women, faking their own demise became a chillingly rational, albeit incredibly dangerous path to freedom. You probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes attempting such a feat, let alone a lifetime of living a lie. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do feel free to post where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself a young woman contemplating your future. From your earliest days, perhaps even before you could properly tie your bonnet, the narrative has been consistent. Your ultimate purpose, your highest calling, is to be a wife. Your education, if you're fortunate enough to receive one beyond basic accomplishments, is geared towards making you an agreeable companion and a competent mistress of a household. You are taught needlework, perhaps a little French, the art of managing servants, and certainly how to play the pianoforte to entertain guests. But most importantly, you are taught that your life's trajectory, your social standing, your financial security, indeed your entire identity, will be defined by the man you marry. This mainstream historical fact that marriage was essentially the sole viable path for respectable Victorian women was not merely a social expectation, it was a fundamental pillar of society. Imagine the pressure. If you are born into a family with property or wealth, your marriage is often an economic transaction designed to consolidate assets, secure alliances, or elevate social standing. Love, while desirable, is often a secondary consideration, a pleasant bonus if it happens to bloom. If you are from a less affluent background, marriage might represent your only chance for stability, for a roof over your head that isn't dependent on the whims of relatives or the brutal demands of the factory floor. The alternative, for most women, was a life of precarious spinsterhood, perhaps as a governess or companion, a life often marked by poverty, loneliness, and a distinct lack of status. It's a bit like being told that there's only one train leaving the station, and if you don't get on it, you're left stranded, probably in a rather unpleasant marsh, and once you are on that train, once those vows are spoken, your fate is sealed, for better or worse, indeed. This seemingly simple phrase held an immense, almost suffocating weight in the Victorian era. There was no easy off-ramp, no convenient escape clause. You are bound legally and socially to your husband. This quiet certainty, this utter finality of matrimony, formed the bedrock of Victorian domestic life. Historians still argue whether the romantic idealization of marriage in Victorian literature served to sugarcoat the harsh realities of women's limited choices, or if it genuinely reflected a widespread yearning for domestic bliss. It's a complex question, isn't it? Because while some women undoubtedly found happiness and companionship, others found themselves trapped in gilded cages, or worse, in outright prisons. This universal expectation, this singular path, is what made any deviation, any thought of escape feel utterly impossible, utterly radical. Yet for some, the impossible became the only possibility. Once you, a Victorian woman, were married, the legal landscape transformed dramatically, effectively erasing your independent existence. This brings us to the chilling reality of legal entrapment and coverture. Imagine standing before the altar, saying your vows, and with each word, your very identity as a legal individual slowly dissolves. Under the doctrine of coverture, a cornerstone of English common law, a married woman's legal rights and indeed her very existence were subsumed by her husband's. She became, in effect, his property. You see, upon marriage, your husband gained control over all your property, including any inheritance or earnings you might acquire. If you had money before marriage, it became his. If you earned money as a writer or seamstress, it was legally his. Even your children were legally considered solely his property. You couldn't enter into contracts, sue or be sued, or even make a will without his consent. Your voice in the legal world was silenced. His became yours. This mainstream historical fact, the legal doctrine of coverture, was a colossal legal barrier, rendering married women utterly dependent and, in many respects, without individual rights. It's a bit like stepping into a partnership where one person legally ceases to exist and all their assets and decisions are managed by the other. Historians still argue whether the practical application of coverture was as universally oppressive as the legal texts suggest, or if individual circumstances and a husband's benevolence could sometimes mitigate its harshest effects. It's a nuanced discussion, isn't it? Because while some women undoubtedly lived under truly oppressive conditions, others might have experienced a gentler, though still legally defined, dependency. Nevertheless, the legal framework itself provided little to no recourse if a marriage turned sour. You were bound tightly by the threads of the law, with virtually no legal avenues for escape. Consider a quirky tidbit. Before marriage, a woman was known as a feme sole, meaning woman alone, possessing certain legal rights. Upon marriage, she became a feme covert, or covered woman, indicating her covered, or subsumed, legal status. Imagine literally losing your legal aliveness simply by saying, "I do." It sounds almost fantastical to our modern ears, doesn't it? The quiet despair of realizing that your personal agency, your very right to self-determination, had effectively vanished the moment you signed the marriage register must have been a profoundly unsettling realization. This legal binding, this complete absorption of your legal personhood, meant that traditional divorce was incredibly difficult, leaving many women feeling utterly trapped within unhappy or even dangerous unions. The escape, if it came, would have to be extra-legal outside the confines of the law that now owned you. With legal avenues to independence largely closed and your identity subsumed by your husband's, the grim reality of domestic abuse's dark shadow becomes starkly apparent. Imagine you, a Victorian wife, living in a seemingly respectable home, perhaps surrounded by delicate china and polished mahogany. Yet behind closed doors, a very different reality might unfold, one marked by fear, coercion, and physical or emotional cruelty. For many women, marriage was not just a legal trap, it was a personal prison where violence and abuse were tragically common and often hidden from the public eye. You see, in Victorian society, the concept of privacy within the domestic sphere was paramount. What happened within a household was considered a private matter, not subject to outside interference. The husband was the undisputed head of the household, with broad legal rights, including the right to chastise his wife. While extreme brutality was frowned upon, milder forms of physical discipline were often tolerated or at least ignored. There were no hotlines, no shelters, no easy escape routes. A woman enduring abuse was largely left to her own devices, with limited sympathy from the legal system or society at large. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive, often unpunished reality of domestic abuse in Victorian marriages, was a driving force behind some women's desperate search for any escape. Historians still argue whether the apparent increase in reported cases of domestic violence towards the end of the Victorian era reflected a genuine rise in abuse, or simply a growing willingness of women to speak out and for the nascent social reform movements to acknowledge the issue. It's a bit like discovering cracks in a wall that have always been there, but only now are you looking for them. You might be living in constant fear, walking on eggshells, knowing that any perceived transgression could provoke your husband's wrath. Your physical safety, your emotional well-being, could be entirely at the mercy of a man who held all the legal cards. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian legal scholars actually debated the acceptable size of a stick a husband could use to beat his wife. The infamous rule of thumb, often misattributed to this period, suggesting a stick no thicker than a man's thumb, illustrates the terrifying casualness with which marital violence could be discussed and tacitly accepted in certain legal circles. Imagine that level of depravity being debated by respectable men. The quiet shame and terror of being a victim with no one to turn to, no official recourse, must have been utterly debilitating. And for women caught in such a horrifying reality, the idea of simply disappearing, of vanishing entirely from their tormentor's life, must have taken root as a terrifying yet profoundly tempting fantasy. The thought of feigning death, however, macabre might have seemed like the only viable path to genuine, lasting freedom. Beyond the crushing weight of legal entrapment and the horrors of domestic abuse, another formidable force could drive a Victorian woman to desperate measures, financial desperation, and ruin. Imagine you, a wife, perhaps from a family of modest means or even one of considerable wealth. Suddenly circumstances shift. Your husband, who, remember, legally controls all your assets, might be a reckless gambler, a foolish investor, or simply unlucky in business. The spectre of bankruptcy, debt, or outright poverty looms large, threatening to drag you and any children into destitution. You see, without any independent legal standing, a married woman had virtually no protection against her husband's financial missteps. If he incurred debts, those debts effectively became yours too. Your family home, your dowry, even your personal belongings could be seized by creditors. There were no joint accounts in the modern sense, no separate legal entities for married women to shield their assets. A husband's ruin was your ruin, entirely and irrevocably. This mainstream historical fact, the complete financial vulnerability of married women under coverture, was a terrifying reality that could lead to destitution, even if you had brought significant wealth into the marriage. Historians still argue whether the increasing instances of male financial failure in the burgeoning yet volatile Victorian economy contributed directly to women's heightened desperation and desire for escape. It's a bit like being tied to a ship that's slowly sinking and realizing you can't even untie yourself. You might witness your family's fortune, or what little security you had, evaporate before your eyes, knowing you are powerless to stop it. The shame of bankruptcy, the terror of ending up in a workhouse, or the indignity of relying on charity would have been a profoundly humiliating prospect. Here's a quirky tidbit. To try and offer some small protection, separate property clauses began to appear in some marriage settlements for wealthy women towards the end of the century, allowing certain assets to remain under the wife's control. But these were rare, complex, and certainly not available to the vast majority of women. Imagine relying on a loophole that only the very rich could afford, knowing that for everyone else, financial ruin meant utter collapse. The quiet anxiety, of living at the mercy of another's financial decisions with no recourse if those decisions were disastrous, must have been a constant, gnawing fear. And for some, the only way to avoid being dragged down by a husband's financial folly to secure any semblance of future for themselves or their children was to simply cease to exist in his world, to literally vanish, leaving the debts and the shame behind, becoming a ghost to their former lives. When legal and financial avenues offered no escape, and the home front became a battleground, a Victorian woman quickly realized the near impossibility of legal recourse. This brings us to the crushing reality of the social stigma of divorce. Imagine you, a woman trapped in an unbearable marriage, daring to even think of ending it. The mere suggestion would be met with gasps, whispers, and a complete social ostracization that could leave you utterly ruined. Divorce in Victorian society was not merely difficult, it was a societal death sentence, almost as absolute as the physical one some women would eventually fake. You see, for the vast majority of the Victorian era, divorce was incredibly rare and accessible almost exclusively to the very wealthy. Before the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, a full divorce required an Act of Parliament, a lengthy, prohibitively expensive and publicly humiliating process that only a handful of elite men could even contemplate. Even after 1857, while divorces became slightly more common, the grounds were still heavily biased against women. A man could divorce his wife for adultery, but a woman generally needed to prove adultery, plus additional offences like cruelty, desertion, or bigamy. It was a clear double standard firmly entrenched in the legal system. This mainstream historical fact, the near impossibility and profound social disgrace of divorce for Victorian women, meant that for most, dissolving a marriage was simply not an option. Historians still argue whether the extreme difficulty of divorce inadvertently strengthened the institution of marriage by forcing couples to endure, or if it simply fostered a culture of secret misery and illicit affairs. It's a bit like trying to hold a leaky bucket together with sticky tape. You might keep some water in, but the mess is considerable. You might yearn for freedom, for a life away from your tormentor or your financial ruin, but the legal and social walls around you are seemingly impenetrable. The shame associated with divorce for women was particularly severe. A divorced woman was often seen as fallen, stripped of her respectability, and effectively cast out of polite society. She would lose custody of her children, her reputation would be irrevocably tarnished, and her economic prospects would be dire. Here's a quirky tidbit. One of the more scandalous divorce cases of the era involved Caroline Norton, whose husband's abuse and manipulation prevented her from accessing her own earnings and children. Her tireless advocacy, though she herself could not easily divorce, highlighted the draconian laws and eventually contributed to reforms like the Married Women's Property Acts. Imagine the sheer audacity and courage it took for a woman like Norton to challenge the entire legal establishment. The quiet terror of facing such complete social ruin, coupled with the legal barriers, meant that for many women, even contemplating divorce was a terrifying thought experiment, not a viable plan. So if legal separation was akin to social suicide, then perhaps literal disappearance, however elaborate, began to appear as the only pathway to a genuine, unburdened future. With divorce a virtual impossibility and public reputation paramount, Victorian society presented another chilling solution for unruly women: the asylum. Imagine you, a woman displaying any behavior deemed inconvenient or nonconformist by your husband or family, so perhaps too much independence, intellectual curiosity, or simply an unwillingness to adhere to the rigid domestic ideal. You might find yourself facing the horrifying prospect of confinement in a mental institution, often on the flimsiest of pretexts. This brings us to the chilling reality of asylums controlling unruly women. You see, in the absence of robust legal protections for women, and with limited understanding of mental health, private asylums became a terrifyingly convenient tool for controlling wives who were deemed problematic. A husband could, with relatively little difficulty, have his wife committed if she was deemed insane, hysterical, or even just difficult. Once inside, escaping was virtually impossible, as you would be stripped of your rights, your word, dismissed as the ramblings of a mad woman, and your freedom entirely contingent on the will of the male figures who placed you there. This mainstream historical fact, the use of asylums as a means of social control over women, was a stark reality for many who dared to defy expectations or were simply inconvenient. Historians still argue whether the apparent rise in female asylum admissions reflected a genuine increase in mental illness, or simply a societal mechanism for managing women who were deemed inconvenient, rebellious, or troublesome. It's a bit like deciding that a squeaky wheel should be locked away, rather than oiled. You might be perfectly sane, but in the oppressive atmosphere of a Victorian asylum, surrounded by genuine mental distress, you might find yourself slipping into a profound despair, your sanity eroded by the very act of confinement. Your pleas for release would fall on deaf ears, dismissed as symptoms of your condition. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some women were committed for conditions as vague as moral insanity or nervous excitement after arguing with their husbands, or expressing desires for education beyond the domestic sphere. Imagine being locked away simply for having an opinion. The quiet terror of facing such a fate, of having your mind and body imprisoned with no hope of external rescue, must have been utterly soul-destroying. For a woman teetering on the edge of desperation, the fear of this institutionalization, of being buried alive in an asylum, might have made the idea of a self-orchestrated death seem like a preferable, if equally terrifying, alternative. Better to be truly free, even if it meant being a ghost, than a living captive. Faced with such an array of grim prospects, legal oblivion, domestic abuse, financial ruin, or the chilling spectre of the asylum, a desperate Victorian woman might find a radical idea slowly taking root in her mind. This is the genesis of the escape idea forms. Imagine you sitting alone by the flickering gaslight, perhaps stitching a sampler or reading a forbidden novel, when the terrifying yet intoxicating thought begins to crystallize. What if you could simply disappear? Not just run away, for that would leave you a vulnerable fugitive, but truly vanish, becoming a ghost to your old life. You see, for women in this era, running away meant abandoning your legal identity, your property, and often, tragically, your children, who were legally your husbands. It meant becoming a societal pariah with no legal standing, no means of support, and a constant fear of being discovered and forcibly returned. The risks were immense, the prospects bleak. But what if the running away wasn't seen as flight, but as a final, definitive departure? What if, instead of being a runaway, you were a mourned, albeit inconveniently deceased, individual? This mainstream historical fact, the extreme difficulty of simple elopement or desertion for women, is what made the more elaborate, macabre fantasy of faking one's own death a seemingly viable, if utterly audacious, solution. Historians still argue whether such elaborate schemes were spontaneous acts of desperation, or if they were carefully plotted over long periods, born from a slow, agonizing realization of limited options. It's a bit like a pressure cooker slowly building steam. The idea of escape might simmer for years before finally boiling over into a concrete plan. You might spend countless sleepless nights turning the idea over in your mind, weighing the terrifying risks against the even more terrifying alternative of remaining trapped. The details, no matter how outlandish, would begin to fall into place, driven by a profound yearning for freedom. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some women who actually attempted such escapes were reportedly inspired by popular Victorian sensational. Novels where characters often fake deaths or disappear to escape dire circumstances. Imagine finding a perverse sort of instruction manual in your latest serialized fiction. The quiet thrill of imagining a life unburdened, a new identity, a fresh start, must have been a powerful counterpoint to the suffocating reality of your everyday existence. The notion of a death that was not an end but a beginning would be a compelling, albeit dangerous, fantasy. This idea, born of desperation and fed by the very constraints of Victorian life, was the first terrifying step towards an unimaginable deception. Once the terrifying seed of escape had taken root, the next, even more audacious, step for a Victorian woman was crafting the death illusion. Imagine you, a woman, meticulously planning your own disappearance, not merely running away, but constructing a narrative so convincing that the world would mourn you as deceased. This wasn't a sudden flight of fancy. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, a macabre masterpiece of deception designed to sever every tie to your old, unbearable life. You'd begin by laying the groundwork, perhaps by subtly withdrawing from social engagements, cultivating a reputation for ill health, or complaining at the vague but persistent ailments. This might involve feigning consumption, that fashionable and tragically common killer of the era, or a mysterious, nervous affliction that slowly saps your strength. The goal was to gradually prepare your family and acquaintances for the inevitable, making your eventual demise seem not only plausible but expected. This mainstream historical fact, the careful, prolonged preparation involved in faking a death, highlights the immense foresight and psychological fortitude required to execute such a deception. Historians still argue whether the success of these deceptions relied more on the perpetrator's acting skills or on the prevalent medical ignorance of the era, which made it easier to fake illnesses and sudden declines. It's a bit like trying to put on a play for an audience that's only seen shadow puppets. Their expectations are low, making your performance seem masterful. You might spend hours practicing a hacking cough, carefully applying pallor to your skin, or cultivating a delicate, fading demeanor. Every gesture, every whispered word would be part of your meticulously crafted performance, a slow descent into a fabricated illness. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some women would reportedly take to their beds for extended periods, refusing food, or appearing perpetually frail, often claiming strange symptoms that doctors of the time struggled to accurately diagnose. Imagine your family doctor, a well-meaning but often bewildered man, shaking his head and lamenting your mysterious decline, all while you're secretly plotting your grand exit. The quiet tension of maintaining this elaborate charade, the constant fear of slipping up, must have been a relentless pressure. But the promise of absolute freedom, of a life truly unburdened, would fuel your performance. Your very last act, as the Victorian woman you once were, would be to orchestrate your own disappearance, making sure the curtain fell definitively on your old self. With your fabricated illness seemingly taking its toll, the next crucial and perhaps most macabre step was feigning illness and demise itself. Imagine you, a Victorian woman now bedridden, your room hushed and dim, the air thick with the scent of camphor and worry. This is the crescendo of your performance, the moment you must convince everyone, even those closest to you, that you are truly slipping away. You might engage in truly dedicated acts of deception, perhaps refusing to eat, leading to a visible emaciation that would fuel fears of your decline. You might meticulously describe symptoms consistent with a known, fatal illness of the day, consumption being a popular choice with its lingering coughs and gradual wasting. The slightest tremor of your hand, a carefully timed gasp, a distant, glassy stare. Every detail would contribute to the illusion of your fading life. This mainstream historical fact, the reliance on visible symptoms and a gradual decline, to convince family and medical professionals, highlights the vulnerability of Victorian medicine to sophisticated deception. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of such performances was due to the limited diagnostic tools of the era or simply the desperate desire of families to believe their loved ones were indeed ill rather than faking it. It's a bit like a magician performing a trick for a truly eager audience. They want to believe, so they often help you along. You would be counting on the general ignorance of specific diseases and the prevailing belief in mysterious vapors and humors that could explain any odd symptom. The quiet terror of maintaining this constant charade, of enduring the grief and concern of your loved ones, even as you orchestrate their sorrow, must have been an enormous psychological burden. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest that desperate women might even induce temporary unconsciousness or extreme weakness using mild sedatives or carefully controlled fasting, making their death appear even more convincing. Imagine taking a calculated risk with your own body, teetering on the edge of genuine illness, all to achieve the illusion of death. The quiet irony of a person actively trying to look less alive in order to gain a new life is profound, isn't it? As the final moments approached, perhaps a doctor would declare you beyond hope, or a pulse would become imperceptible to trembling fingers. This final, dramatic collapse would seal your fate as truly deceased, opening the door to your terrifying yet longed-for rebirth. With the illusion of your demise now firmly established, the most macabre part of your escape plan would unfold: the coffin and burial hoax. Imagine the hushed solemnity of your funeral. The scent of lilies and damp earth fills the air, mingling with the heavy perfume of grief. Your friends and family, cloaked in black, gather around a coffin that supposedly contains your lifeless body. This wasn't merely about feigning death, it was about ensuring a public, undeniable end to your old identity, sealing your fate as truly gone. You see, for this deception to be truly effective, the appearance of a burial was paramount. This might involve an empty coffin or one filled with weights and stones to simulate the appropriate heft. The funeral director, if complicit or simply unsuspecting, would perform their duties with all the customary gravitas. The mourners would shed their tears, the eulogies would be read, and the coffin would be lowered into the cold earth. This mainstream historical fact, the elaborate staging of funerals, sometimes even with an empty coffin, to create a convincing public record of death, highlights the lengths to which these desperate women and their accomplices would go. Historians still argue whether the complicity of undertakers or medical professionals in such schemes was more widespread than records suggest, or if they were merely unwitting participants in incredibly clever deceptions. It's a bit like a magic show where the audience is so eager to believe they overlook the simple trick. You might be watching from a hidden vantage point, perhaps disguised, witnessing your own funeral, hearing the pronouncements of your demise. The quiet agony of seeing your loved ones genuinely grieve, even as you orchestrate their sorrow, must have been an immense psychological burden. Every tear shed for your death would be a testament to the success of your performance, but also a haunting reminder of the lives you were leaving behind. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some desperate individuals even went to the extent of having a personalized tombstone carved, complete with dates of birth and death, further cementing their fictitious end. Imagine commissioning your own memorial, a permanent marker of your non-existence. The quiet thrill of knowing you were literally burying your past self, coupled with the chilling reality of severing all ties, must have been overwhelming. The finality of the burial, the solemn turning of the earth, was the ultimate curtain call on your old life, allowing you, the ghost, to slip away into a new, unburdened existence. Of course, orchestrating such a complex and macabre deception rarely, if ever, happened in complete isolation. For a Victorian woman to successfully vanish, she almost invariably needed aiding and abetting from secret allies. Imagine you in the throes of planning your escape, entrusting your life's most dangerous secret to another soul. This wasn't merely asking for a favor, it was demanding absolute loyalty, risking their reputation and potentially their freedom alongside your own. You might rely on a trusted family member, a sympathetic sister, a discreet aunt, or even a disillusioned servant who, for reasons of their own, felt compelled to help you escape an unbearable situation. Perhaps they had witnessed the abuse, understood the financial ruin, or simply recognized the profound despair driving you to such desperate lengths. These silent partners would be crucial for everything from spreading rumors of your failing health to arranging for a suitable, empty coffin, or even providing a safe haven for your immediate disappearance. This mainstream historical fact, the necessity of covert assistance for a successful faked death, underscores the network of empathy and defiance that sometimes existed beneath the veneer of Victorian propriety. Historians still argue whether such accomplices were motivated purely by compassion, by a shared animosity towards the husband, or by some form of financial compensation for their silence and efforts. It's a bit like wondering if someone helps you move because they genuinely like you, or because you promised them pizza. The motivations were likely varied and complex, but their role was undeniable. You would be placing your entire future, your very survival in their hands, a terrifying leap of faith that could lead to either liberation or utter ruin. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some cases suggest that medical professionals, disillusioned by the limitations placed on women, or even witnessing firsthand the abuses, might have turned a blind eye or subtly assisted in creating the illusion of death. Imagine a doctor whose ethical code dictated saving lives, quietly helping a patient pretend to die in order to save her from a living hell. The quiet tension of such a conspiracy, the hushed conversations, the coded messages, would be a constant background hum to your perilous plan. These hidden alliances were the fragile yet essential threads that allowed the elaborate tapestry of a faked death to be woven, allowing you to slip through the veil of existence into a new, unseen life. Having successfully orchestrated your death and funeral, the truly terrifying yet exhilarating next step was to embrace a new identity, a new life. Imagine you, a woman who was supposedly 6 feet under, now stepping into a meticulously crafted persona, shedding every vestige of your former self. This wasn't merely a change of address, it was a total reinvention, a deliberate erasure of the woman you once were, replaced by someone entirely new. You might adopt a different name, perhaps one that sounds utterly mundane, designed to blend into the background. Your appearance would change drastically. A different hairstyle, perhaps a different color, a change in your typical attire to avoid any hint of your past. You would need to perfect a new backstory, a believable narrative of where you came from, what your life had been before this moment. Every detail from your accent to your mannerisms would need to be considered and adjusted. This mainstream historical fact, the complete overhaul of identity required for a successful escape, highlights the immense psychological burden and sheer ingenuity of these women. Historians still argue whether the perceived success of these new identities relied more on the simplicity of the disguise or on the fact that Victorian society simply wasn't equipped to track individuals in the way modern societies can. It's a bit like trying to find a specific grain of sand on a vast beach, especially if that grain of sand has painted itself a different color. You would be counting on the limited photographic records, the lack of centralized databases, and the general belief that once someone was buried, they simply were gone. You might find yourself in a bustling new city, perhaps London or Manchester, where anonymity was a greater possibility, far from the prying eyes of your former life. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some women would reportedly choose professions or living arrangements that offered maximum anonymity, such as becoming a domestic servant in a large, impersonal household, or moving to a distant colonial outpost. Imagine exchanging a life of potentially suffocating privilege or crushing domesticity for the quiet, solitary freedom of a new, unseen existence. The quiet thrill of independence, of making your own choices, no matter how small, would be intoxicating. But this freedom came with a heavy price: the constant vigilance, the fear of discovery, and the profound loneliness of having severed all ties to your past. Your new life was yours, utterly, but it was also a life built on a foundation of silence and perpetual concealment. Even with a meticulously crafted new identity, the spectre of the past always lingered, leading to the constant perils of discovery. Imagine you living your new, anonymous life, perhaps years removed from your death. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face in a crowd, every overheard snippet of conversation could send a jolt of ice through your veins. The freedom you'd fought so desperately for was forever shadowed by the chilling possibility of recognition and exposure. You see, while Victorian society lacked modern surveillance, human memory and coincidence were potent threats. A chance encounter with someone from your old life, a distant relative, a former neighbor, even a casual acquaintance, could unravel years of careful deception. Imagine walking down a bustling street, turning a corner, and suddenly seeing a familiar face, a face that knows the woman you used to be. The sheer panic, the need to disappear into the crowd before being spotted, would be an ever-present anxiety. This mainstream historical fact, the constant fear of accidental recognition, highlights the immense psychological toll of living a life built on a lie. Historians still argue whether the long-term psychological burden of living a hidden life often outweighed the benefits of escape, or, if the freedom gained, genuinely provided a better existence. It's a bit like buying a beautiful, expensive painting, only to discover it comes with a tiny, persistent insect infestation you can never quite get rid of. You might have escaped a terrible marriage, but you had sentenced yourself to a life of perpetual vigilance, unable to form deep connections for fear of revealing your true past. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some individuals who faked their deaths reportedly changed their names multiple times over the course of their new lives, moving from town to town, constantly trying to outrun the phantom of their former selves. Imagine the exhaustion, the rootlessness of such an existence, always on the move, always wary. The quiet terror of having your carefully constructed new world crumble around you, of being dragged back to the life you so desperately fled, must have been suffocating. And while the act of faking your death might have granted physical freedom, the emotional and psychological chains of concealment remained, a constant reminder of the extreme lengths you went to for a semblance of peace. Ultimately, the stories of Victorian women who faked their own deaths, though compelling, highlight a stark reality. These were rare successes achieved at a profound cost. Imagine you, years into your new life, looking back at the elaborate deception you orchestrated. The freedom you now possess is palpable, a precious commodity, but it's forever tainted by the sacrifices you made and the shadows you carry. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a gritty, high-stakes gamble where true victory was measured not just in escape, but in the enduring ability to live with the consequences. You see, for every rumored success, countless others likely failed, facing discovery, disgrace, or even worse fates. The Victorian era, despite its romanticized veneer, was a brutal one for women who dared to defy societal norms. Those who did manage to disappear lived lives of constant vigilance, always looking over their shoulder, unable to fully shed the fear of recognition. The cost was immense, the severance of all family ties, the inability to truly mourn lost loved ones, the profound loneliness of living a lie. This mainstream historical fact that such elaborate escapes were exceedingly rare and demanded unimaginable personal sacrifice underscores the severe limitations placed on women's autonomy in the 19th century. Historians still argue whether the few known successful cases were due to exceptional planning and luck, or if the vast majority of attempts simply went unrecorded, swallowed by the anonymity they sought. It's a bit like trying to find a needle in a haystack, only the needle is also trying very hard not to be found. You might be physically free, but emotionally you are tethered to the past, haunted by the spectre of discovery and the ghost of the life you left behind. The joyous liberation of a new beginning was always tempered by the quiet sorrow of a life irrevocably lost. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some women who disappeared might have ended up in bustling, anonymous places like burgeoning industrial cities, or even emigrated to distant colonies, deliberately seeking environments where a fresh start was more plausible. Imagine the journey across an ocean, leaving behind everything familiar for a land where no one knew your name or your history. The quiet courage it took to undertake such a voyage, both physically and emotionally, must have been extraordinary. And for all their triumphs, these rare individuals carried the weight of their profound secret, a silent testament to the extreme lengths a woman would go to reclaim ownership of her own existence in a world that denied it. The stories of Victorian women who faked their own deaths, though perhaps few in number, leave an enduring echo in the annals of history. Imagine the whispers, carried on the wind through generations, of a woman who simply vanished, leaving behind only the chilling tale of her supposed demise. These extreme acts of defiance, born from profound desperation, are not just morbid curiosities. They are potent symbols of the relentless human yearning for freedom and self-determination, especially when faced with seemingly insurmountable societal barriers. You see, these narratives, whether confirmed fact or whispered legend, stand as a powerful testament to the stifling confines of Victorian marriage and the profound lack of legal or social recourse available to women. They highlight an era where a woman's identity was so thoroughly subsumed by her husband's that her only perceived path to liberation was a radical, utterly absolute break with her past. This mainstream historical fact, the very existence of these faked deaths, reveals the hidden struggles beneath the era's prim exterior, exposing the desperate measures women would resort to for autonomy. Historians still argue whether these extreme acts truly represent the collective despair of Victorian women, or if they were the isolated actions of a few uniquely desperate or resourceful individuals. It's a bit like trying to infer the entire landscape from a single dramatic peak. The peak is certainly striking, but it doesn't tell the whole story of the valleys and plateaus below. You might consider the quiet revolution these women embodied, even if they never saw themselves as revolutionaries, their actions speaking volumes about the unyielding pressure they faced. Here's a quirky tidbit. The fascination with missing persons and mysterious disappearances actually fueled much of the Victorian popular fiction, providing a perverse kind of inspiration, or at least a conceptual framework for those contemplating such a drastic step. Imagine your own desperate thoughts finding a strange resonance in a penny dreadful novel, a chilling mirroring of your reality. The quiet resilience of these women, their unwavering desire for a life on their own terms, continues to resonate, Even in our modern world, where such drastic measures are, thankfully, largely unnecessary, their vanished footsteps echo a powerful story of survival, a testament to the lengths one will go to truly own their own life. As the gaslights dim and the hum of the city outside fades, you can almost feel the chill of an empty coffin, the quiet footsteps of a woman slipping away into the night, leaving behind a life unlived to begin one anew. Let the anxieties of a bygone era, the struggle for autonomy, gently recede now. The history, the knowledge, the quiet defiance of those women now drifts away on the soft currents of your breath. Allow yourself to loosen your grip on the dazed thoughts, letting them soften and blur. The whispers of the past are becoming fainter, merging with the calm, steady rhythm of your own heart. All the complexities, all the worries, all the curious details, they are simply sounds now, fading into the comfortable quiet. Just listen to the soft hush. Feel the peaceful stillness surrounding you, and let your mind unwind. Sweet dreams.